How about another hand for Emily? Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. Truly, I'm very grateful to all of you for, one, being here, but also for the patience and flexibility each of you have demonstrated as we've had to kind of shift our strategy a little bit to manage the weather. The crew outside, most of them are seasonal rangers, and they have been absolutely instrumental in helping us manage this. So if you leave, make sure that you say hi, and if you appreciated the programming, please let them know, because they're the ones that are actually making sure we get as many people in here as we can. I also want to do one other call out for the folks in the back from Addressing Gettysburg. That's Derek, that's Tad, that's Matt Callery, who I'm sure many of you know. So I talked with Matt at 5 p.m. on June 30th, and he dropped everything he was going to do and promised us that he'd be here, he'd film everything, he'd get it out as quickly as possible. The idea being that we knew we were not going to have enough room to accommodate everyone. And so now all of that content is all online, and it's free for anyone to watch. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am to Matt and the Addressing Gettysburg team. And I honestly think for Matt, it's a kind of patriotism. He's not making any money off this. He's doing it out of the goodness of his heart. So if you happen to see Matt or the team back there again, please express your appreciation. So my name is Christopher Gwinn. I serve as the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at Gettysburg National Military Park. And some of you may have heard this story before, but about 20 years ago when I was here as an intern, I was leading a hike out on the battlefield. And it was about Pickett's Charge, and we were out on Cemetery Ridge. So this was, early 2000s. And I had a group of about 20 or 30 people on this talk, and we're exploring the battlefield together. And at the conclusion of my talk, answering questions, chatting with visitors, and I had this older gentleman come up, and he told me a story. He said that he grew up in Gettysburg. It was his hometown. And he was here on the battlefield in 1938. And he told me the story of what we're going to talk about today, the 75th anniversary of the battle and the final reunion of the surviving Civil War veterans. And he told me in 1938 he was a Boy Scout. And to help out with this big event that we're going to explore, they brought in a lot of different organizations, the Army, Red Cross. Well, they brought in the Boy Scouts to help manage this. And this gentleman, who I was talking to on Cemetery Ridge, told me, grew up in Gettysburg, he was a Boy Scout. In 1938, they brought him to the park to help out with this big event, and they were going to pair him up with this old Confederate veteran who was visiting. And this gentleman told me this guy looked exactly like you would think a 97-year-old Confederate veteran would look like. He had a long, ragged gray jacket on, a long gray beard. And his job was basically to keep him alive. So get him off the train on June 30th, put him back on the train on July 5th, keep him alive. And so for those 3 or 4 days, they explored the battlefield together. They met Franklin Roosevelt. They saw monument dedications. They explored the camps. But this gentleman told me a story he said he was never going to forget. On July 3rd, 1938, anniversary of Pickett's Charge, this old Confederate veteran wanted to reenact what he had done earlier, 75 years before, as a young man. He wanted to walk the route of the attack. So that's what they did. So you had this young Boy Scout and this old Confederate veteran making their way across the battlefield. And all of a sudden, about halfway across the field, they stop. Confederate veteran stops all of a sudden, throws his hand out, he stops the scout. And he takes off his hat, parts his gray hair with his fingers, and shows the Boy Scout this long, jagged scar in his skull from where on July 3rd, 1863, at the height of the attack, he had been hit in the head by an artillery shell fragment. Obviously, he didn't kill him, but the old Confederate veteran told that Boy Scout that that was the last spot and the last thing he remembered about the Battle of Gettysburg. He woke up a few days later at Union Field Hospital. And so that story was told to me by the man that heard it from the Civil War veteran. And that captivated my interest in this story. The 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and the final reunion of the surviving Civil War veterans. And so between June 30th and the 4th of July, 1938, some 1,000 845 surviving Civil War veterans, each with an attendant, came back to Gettysburg. They traveled an average of 700 miles to get to the battlefield. They did it entirely at the expense of the United States government. They came from every state in the Union with the exception of Rhode Island. They came from Washington, D.C. They came from Canada. And for 4 days, this encampment of aged Civil War veterans plopped itself down on the Gettysburg battlefield. Average age was in 94. The youngest was 88. The oldest claimed to be 112 years old. Claimed to be 112 years old. And I think for virtually all of them, every single one of them, they recognized that this was going to be the last great adventure, the last great event of very eventful lives. This was going to be it. And among these Civil War veterans were representatives from some of the most famous units in the American Civil War. You had veterans of the Philadelphia Brigade here. You had veterans of the Iron Brigade. You had men that fought at Chickamauga under William Rosecrans. You had veterans from the Stonewall Brigade. You had men that participated in Pickett's Charge, Confederates that made their way across that battlefield. You had soldiers from the United States Colored Troops, men from the 54th Massachusetts. You didn't have to be a Gettysburg veteran. This was open to all veterans. So virtually every major event of the American Civil War was represented through these 1,800 men that came back to the battlefield. And over the course of those couple of days, these veterans were treated to demonstrations by the modern United States military. B-17 bombers flew overhead. So these same veterans that had marched to Georgia with William Tecumseh Sherman were now witnessing the modern firepower and capabilities of the modern United States military. Legions of press, photographers, radio men, reporters descended on the Gettysburg battlefield to record for posterity what they recognized was going to be the last reunion of these veterans. The single largest event to ever happen in Gettysburg is not the battle. It's the 1938 reunion. An estimated 450,000 Americans visited the battlefield over those 4 days. On July 3rd alone, for the dedication of the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, an estimated 250,000 people crammed into the fields in front of Oak Hill to see that monument unveiled and to hear President Franklin Roosevelt dedicate it. Millions more would follow along at home through newspapers or radio shows. And then, on July 5th, the veterans began the long trip back home. And so a chapter of American history was over. For Americans in 1938, 1863 was as removed from them as 1951 is for us today. And if you were a 10-year-old in 1938, you'd be, 98 years old today? So we are still surrounded by individuals who met Civil War veterans. That's the other thing that has captivated me about this event, and that it is still within living memory of us today. There's still a human bridge between us and the men that fought in the American Civil War. And Americans were captivated in 1938, and I still think they're captivated today. And a lot of it is because of images and radio programs, but especially images like the one you have up on the screen. And here we have an image from the 1938 reunion of these two impossibly old enemies coming back to the battlefield, shaking hands across the wall that divided them in battle and in life. And I think for modern Americans, when they see an image like that, it demonstrates that as divided as we are as Americans, we can look to these old men who fought at Gettysburg and are able to come back 75 years later and meet their former enemies with dignity and compassion. Why can't we as Americans today look past our differences? And I think there's a lot of truth to that, But a lot like other Gettysburg things, I think the more you look at it, the less you see. And what we're going to do today is delve into this image and this event. We're going to look at the periphery. We're going to look at how the event was organized, what factors are at play, and what brought these old Civil War veterans back to Gettysburg in 1938. But to do that, we've got to go back a little bit. First thing I'll remind you all of is that blue and gray reunions at Gettysburg, they get a lot of attention, but they're relatively rare. It doesn't happen a lot. Most of the time when Civil War veterans come back to Gettysburg, they're doing it with their comrades. So all the members of the Philadelphia Brigade are going to come back to Gettysburg, or the survivors of the 20th Maine are going to go to Little Round Top to dedicate their monument. It's very, very rare for Union and Confederate veterans to meet together on the battlefield. And so when it does happen, it gets a lot of attention, it gets a lot of press. The first real big one happens in 1887. And that's when the survivors of the Philadelphia Brigade, who defended the Angle on July 3rd, 1863, when they invited the survivors of Pickett's Virginia Division to come back to the battlefield. You had a couple of hundred Civil War veterans that participated in this, and it is, by all accounts, a remarkable success. There's an enormous amount of goodwill between the Union and Confederate veterans. They have ceremonies at the Angle where for the first time they shake hands across the stone wall. They go to town, they drink together, they smoke cigars. One reporter said you couldn't tell who was a Philadelphia veteran and who was a Virginia veteran because they were swapping uniform items. They're smoking cigars together. There's a lot of inebriated Civil War veterans, but it is, by all accounts, a wonderful event. That is small compared to what happens in 1913. In 1913, 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and this is the brainchild of a Civil War veteran named Henry Heidecopper. They have the Great Peace Jubilee, the great reunion that's going to involve about 50,000 Civil War veterans. Population of the town of Gettysburg in 1913 is about 4,500 people. So for the second time, an invasion of Civil War veterans happens. These 50,000 Civil War veterans encamp on the fields of Pickett's charge. And again, for 3 days, there's monument dedications, there's speeches. President Woodrow Wilson would come to the battlefield to participate in this. Reporters said this did more to eradicate the wounds of the Civil War than anything that had occurred previously. One Union veteran named Andrew Cowan, who would be there, would propose for the first time a monument to peace somewhere on the Gettysburg battlefield. And before it was all over, the then governor of Pennsylvania, a man by the name of John K. Tenner, made a promise. He said, in 25 years, if there are any Civil War veterans left, the state of Pennsylvania will invite them back for one final time. And the 1913 reunion was over, and the Civil War veterans went home, and a lot is going to happen between 1913 and 1938. Of course, you have a lot politically, socially that's occurring, new amendments to the United States Constitution, advances in technology, the First World War. Originally, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial was going to be erected in the years immediately following the 1913 reunion. They actually established a commission to help plan and design for this peace memorial. It includes individuals such as Joshua Chamberlain, Evander Law. But once World War I begins, that's out the door. It's not going to happen anymore. And now you have individuals like Chamberlain who, because of simple age, are dying off. And so for a while, it's forgotten about. But again, lots going to happen. As I mentioned, advances in technology and transportation, and of course the Great Depression, which will fundamentally change American society. And while all of this is happening, as America is changing, the Park Service is changing too. So in 1913, the park was managed by the United States War Department. In 1933, for the first time, the National Park Service will take over. New monuments would be added to the landscape in the 19-teens, 1920s, early 1930s. You have especially a lot of Confederate monuments like Robert E. Lee on the Virginia Memorial, North Carolina, Alabama Memorial. The landscape is evolving at the same time. In 1933, as I mentioned, the Park Service will arrive, and they'll take over custody of the Gettysburg battlefield. And the first superintendent of what is Gettysburg National Military Park is going to be an individual by the name of James McConaughey. James McConaughey is a World War I veteran. He is not a historian by training. He's actually a landscape architect. And he's going to come and he's going to basically establish the National Park Service presence on the Gettysburg battlefield. He inherits a park of a little over 2,000 acres with 1,700 monuments, markers, tablets. He has 24 miles of road he now has to take care of. And he said he had 4 major goals. One is restoration, so restore the battlefield, bring it back a little bit to 1863. Preservation, so acquire new land and preserve it, and then make the battlefield accessible, and he also wanted to make the battlefield usable. And so a lot of the infrastructure that we still use today on the Gettysburg battlefield dates from this time. And for Americans, the 1930s were a really tough decade. For the Park Service, it was great, because the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal is pumping thousands, millions of dollars into the National Park Service. And you have CCC camps sprouting up all over the place, including Gettysburg, to do a lot of this work. So the comfort stations on the battlefield date from this time period. A lot of the trails, a lot of the roads. James McConaughey does a lot of wonderful things. He does some questionable things. As I mentioned, he was a landscape architect, not a historian. And one of the things that he felt very deeply about was that the battlefield with all the monuments looked too crowded. Too many monuments. And so he wanted to hide them by planting trees next to each of the monuments. So he started to do that. He is the individual that levels out the stones in the National Cemetery to make it easier to mow around and to manage. Does a lot of questionable things. He does some good things, though, too. He does some good things. I think McConaughey recognized that he was inheriting a park, a site, that was going from a lived event that was within living memory to an event that was going to be remembered. And no longer were visitors going to be able to depend on Civil War veterans to help them understand what happened at Gettysburg. Now they're going to look to other people. And so McConaughey, along with a historian named Frederick Tilburg, they're going to create the first visitor center at what is today the Gettysburg Library. They're going to create the first tour route through the battlefield, the first brochures, the first museum exhibits. So again, they do a tremendous amount of work. But again, McConaughey was right. The battlefield was going from a lived event to a remembered event. Between the years of 1913 and 1935, an average 1,000 Civil War veterans were dying each year. By the year 1935, membership in this political powerhouse of an organization, the Grand Army of the Republic, had dwindled down to a paltry 6,000 members. It used to be 500,000 members in the Grand Army of the Republic. And so these veterans are dying off very rapidly. But in the Pennsylvania State House up in Harrisburg, they remembered that promise they had made back in 1913 to host one more reunion on the Gettysburg battlefield. And so in 1935, they'll establish a commission. It's called the Pennsylvania Commission. And this is going to be the driving force behind organizing and executing what will be this event in 1938. So there you got the commission. It's really going to be two guys that do most of the work, though. Gentleman on your left is a man by the name of John Rice. John Rice is going to be the chairman of this Pennsylvania delegation commission. He's the one responsible for building political support for this event. He's the one that's going to have to worry about fundraising and getting enough money. In a lot of ways, he's kind of the face of the organization. He's going to be the leader out connecting with individuals in Washington, D.C. and Harrisburg to make this thing happen. And I think in every organization, you have somebody filling that role. But you also have an individual like the guy on the right there. His name is Paul Roy. He's a 35-year-old newspaperman, works for the Gettysburg Times. And his role is of executive secretary. And what that translates to is he's the guy that actually has to go out and get everything done. He's the one that has to go out and make this actually happen. And I think his photo there, which strikes me as an impromptu one, tells you a lot about who he is and how busy he is. One, you got the sign behind him there that says quiet. He's got an enormous amount to deal with. And Paul Roy would talk about some of the challenges in the spring of 1935 that he saw coming if this event was going to happen. One, perhaps the most important, is that he wasn't sure Americans were actually interested in a Civil War reunion. It's really tough to care about Civil War veterans meeting on the Gettysburg battlefield when you don't have a job and you're standing in a soup line. And so at first he didn't think Americans would even care about this. Other than $15,000 from the state of Pennsylvania, he had no money at all to make this happen. So he's got to get the money along with John Rice. Perhaps most importantly, though, in 1935, the living Union and Confederate veterans were not terribly interested, believe it or not, in coming back to Gettysburg. There was a lot of things, even in 1935, that still divided these old Union and Confederate veterans, that still kept those wounds open from the American Civil War. And a lot of these issues had kind of metastasized into the Confederate flag. Union veterans would say, I'm not going to any event where I have to see the Confederate battle flag. And Confederate veterans, in turn, would say, oh, I'm not going to any event where I can't bring my battle flag. And so the first thing Paul Roy needs to do is go out there and convince these old Civil War veterans to put that all aside and to commit to coming back to Gettysburg in 1938. And he had a very difficult job doing that. One of the first things he's going to do is go uninvited to the reunion of the United Confederate Veterans happening in Amarillo, Texas. They've taken over a hotel. He shows up, and Paul Roy knows he has to convince one man in particular. That's the gentleman on the right. His name is Harry Lee. No relation to Robert E. Lee, but at that time, he's the assistant secretary of that organization. And Paul Roy knows he's got to convince this one guy, Harry Lee, to buy into this Gettysburg reunion. And so Paul Roy would surprise Harry Lee in the lobby of this hotel and try to convince him, make his case to come back to Gettysburg. And Harry Lee had known about this guy floating around town. And when a reporter asked, what are you going to say to this commission from Gettysburg? Harry Lee replied, well, I'm going to tell him to go to hell. And that's what he did initially. And that's what he did. But Harry Lee and Paul Roy, they ended up chatting. And after a lot of work, he got Harry Lee to buy into coming back to Gettysburg, to the extent that Harry Lee was going to become one of the event's biggest supporters. And without his buy-in, it's unlikely that many Confederate veterans would have come to Gettysburg in 1938. And he's going to do the same thing at the gathering, the annual gathering of the Grand Army of the Republic. It's happening in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Paul Roy would later say that he faced a wave of opposition from these Union veterans. They wouldn't even formally allow him to speak to the veterans. So he had to conduct basically a guerrilla marketing campaign to try to reach out to individual veterans to get them to come to Gettysburg. And the Grand Army of the Republic will never formally recognize the 1938 reunion as an official event. But they basically told their members, you know what, if you want to go, you can go. Well, how did Paul Roy do this? Well, he promised the Confederate veterans that you can bring your battle flag. You've got to keep it in your camp, but you can bring your battle flag. And he told the Union veterans, they're going to bring their battle flags, but you're not going to have to see it. You're not going to have to march past it. I think a lot of Confederate veterans, they didn't want to be seen as like a spoil of war. Right? Here's the defeated army, and now they're being forced to march in front of the triumphant victors. The same thing for the Union veterans. They didn't want to see the army that they had beaten in life now celebrated 75 years later. So Paul Roy had to work really hard to manage all of those expectations. As I mentioned earlier, ultimately Harry Lee was going to be one of the biggest supporters that Paul Roy found. He would later tell a reporter that he was going to go to Gettysburg if they have to take him there on a stretcher. And unfortunately for Harry Lee, he dies only a few months before the Gettysburg reunion, only 4 months before. So he never actually made it back to the Gettysburg battlefield. And that there, I think, underscores the single greatest challenge, the single greatest threat to the final reunion of the Blue and Gray at Gettysburg. It wasn't money, it wasn't politics, it was time. Every year, every day, Civil War veterans were dying off. In 1937, the Pennsylvania Commission mailed out 12,500 essentially questionnaires to the surviving veterans that they knew of, asking them whether or not they were interested in coming back to Gettysburg. Roughly 70% responded, with about 50% supporting the idea of a reunion. The very next year, when they sent out the final invitation, that initial number of 12,500 dwindled down to only 8,000. Of those 8,000 invitations they sent out, only 2,610 were returned. So you can see every year, every month, those Civil War veterans are dying off. They knew that once you get all of these old veterans back to Gettysburg, they're going to need exceptional medical care. And one of the first things the Pennsylvania Commission did was reach out to the United States military for help. And up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, is a regiment, basically a medical regiment for the United States Army, commanded by this gentleman. His name is Paul Hawley, and he is one of the unsung heroes of the 1938 reunion at Gettysburg. And it's going to be Paul Hawley and his command that will be responsible for medical care for all of these veterans. And it was determined very early on that nothing would be denied these men because of cost, because of anything. If they needed medical care, they were going to get the very best medical care that the United States government could provide them. Paul Hawley and his team estimated that during a normal stretch of 8 days, roughly 90 veterans would die. And this was under normal situations. A trip to Gettysburg and an encampment on the Gettysburg battlefield is not exactly normal. And so they're expecting to have what they called mass casualties at this 1938 event. The Pennsylvania Commission also reached out to the College of Gettysburg campus. And the Gettysburg College campus was going to become ground zero for this 1938 reunion. And so in May and June of 1938, the college would be transformed into this camp for the 1938 reunion. They would lay miles of boardwalk. They would string electrical lines. They would establish tents for every single veteran. College buildings would be taken over as medical facilities, as office space for the reunion. Here you can see 2 campus buildings that are still there today. Pennsylvania Hall, for those 4 days during the reunion, would become the unofficial capital of the state of Pennsylvania. Glatfelter Hall off on the left, that would be one of the medical facilities they would use for these veterans. Every veteran and their attendant would get a tent filled with everything they could possibly need. A cot, a camp kettle, a cushioned chair, crutches, anything that they would need. Now the camps were segregated, not along racial lines, along sectional lines. So one camp running between Howard Avenue, the college campus, and the Carlisle Road would be for the Union veterans. And another camp right across the Mummersburg Road would be for the Confederate veterans. Again, all the Confederates are in one camp with their flag, all the Union veterans in another. And just like every reenactment today in Gettysburg, there's always an Abraham Lincoln present. And there was more than a few that showed up for the 1938 reunion. They hired a legion of buses to transport the veterans everywhere they might want to go on the battlefield. And as I mentioned earlier, they brought in roughly 200 Boy Scouts to help manage this event, to help take care of the veterans that made it to Gettysburg. Now, ultimately, whether or not these veterans came to Gettysburg was an immensely personal question. And I imagine all across the country, these old men were having conversations with their families that must have sounded a little bit like what they had with their parents in 1861 when they were debating enlisting. You know, should I do it? Should I join up? Should I go on this adventure? Should I make this trip? It's going to be dangerous. Is it worth it? A lot of men simply couldn't put the pain and the anger behind them. A lot of men couldn't go back to Gettysburg knowing that their former enemies would be there. One man named Joseph Hayward from California, he told a local newspaper 75 years had done nothing to reconstruct him, and that he hated the rebels as much in 1938 as he did in 1863. More typical, though, was the sentiment expressed by a man named John Claypool. John Claypool was from St. Louis, Missouri, and he told a reporter that since the good Lord had put up with these Yankees for all these years, he could do so for 4 days. And so he decided to go. The first veteran to arrive in Gettysburg was 90-year-old Alvin Tolman. He was a Navy veteran. He'd served off of Fort Fisher. When they asked him why he got to Gettysburg so early, they told him he wanted to get the pick of the Gettysburg women. That's not the funny part. The funny part is he brought his wife with him. That was his attendant. Alongside individuals like Alvin Tolman, you had Overton Mennett, who was the leader of the Grand Army of the Republic, and John Claypool, who was going to be the symbolic representative or the leader from the Grand Army, from the United Confederate Veterans. Veterans came in from, again, every corner of the country. These gentlemen came all the way from Oklahoma, and they were famous because when they got off the train, they still had their guns with them. You had, veterans from all over. It's more Oklahoma veterans. Some of these gentlemen had fought in the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the Civil War. So again, you didn't have to be a Gettysburg veteran. Every theater of war was represented. Every army was represented by the veterans that came back. Nicholas Van Zant, the gentleman on the far right, he came from Sterling, Illinois. He served in the 9th Illinois Cavalry during the American Civil War. After the war, he also serves with the Salvation Army, and he served in the European theater in World War I. So he was the only veteran there in attendance who had served both in the Great War and also in the American Civil War. But you had others, they traveled relatively short distances. There was a man by the name of Spencer Jones. He was formerly enslaved. He served in the 39th United States Colored Troops. He came from the eastern shore of Maryland. The man that traveled the least was George Krug, 92 years old. He came all the way from Littlestown, Pennsylvania, about 10 miles down the road. All told, 1,845 veterans actually made it to Gettysburg. The vast majority were Union, 1,359, and approximately 486 veterans represented the Confederate Army. Now, in 1913, there's no real evidence that black veterans were invited to that 1913 reunion. There's no real hard evidence that they were invited and able to participate. We know that there were black individuals, black men involved in the 1913 reunion. That's primarily as laborers. And so when I started to research this event, my suspicion was that African-American newspapers and reporters were going to be incredibly critical of this event. You know, here's another reunion at Gettysburg that excludes their part of the story. What I found was the exact opposite. Let's see. There we go. This was going to be a segregated event, like I told you, but not along racial lines, along sectional lines. So you might be a black veteran that served at Fort Wagner, and you might come from a place like Baltimore, Maryland, that was heavily segregated. And you'd get to Gettysburg, and your tent was going to be right next to a white soldier. You'd go into the mess hall to get food, and there'd be a white soldier here, a white soldier there, and you'd be in the middle. Black newspaper coverage was incredibly positive. One said that they had erased the color line at this last encampment. As you can see up on the screen here, headlines like "No Color Line" as Union and Rebel veterans camped together on the battlefield. And so for African-American veterans, this was an incredibly positive event, that they could come back to the Gettysburg battlefield and be treated like this. One would recall that, quote, "all traces of discrimination, both as to racial identity and geographical location, were absent. All eat together, vets filed in to be seated side by side. No one moved away from his neighbor diner, but began a conversation." There are, we estimate, probably as many as 64 veterans who came to Gettysburg in 1938 who had actually fought in the battle itself. So not a lot of them, but some of them. Individuals like George Hamilton, who was 89 years old. He served in the 140th Pennsylvania, and he would recall charging through the wheat field on July 2nd. A lot of the Union and Confederate veterans who had served in Gettysburg remarked that the battlefield didn't look like it did in 1863. The Park Service had let it grow too crowded with trees and everything, which is something I hear from guides all the time today and rangers. Some things stayed the same. William Jackaway, 97 years old, was one of the final survivors of the 72nd Pennsylvania, which was at the angle during Pickett's charge. And William Jackaway, he's another one of those men that commented that the battlefield didn't look quite right. But on the second day of the anniversary, they got him out to Cemetery Ridge. And he went up to the monument to the 72nd Pennsylvania. And reporters watched as he traced the lettering with his fingers. And overcome with emotion, he talked about what a fine bunch of fellows those men were. And he told the reporters that, don't you forget, they stopped that picket man, that picket fellow. James Hammaker was a veteran of Company G, 50th Virginia. He fought at Culp's Hill. He was wounded at least twice on Culp's Hill, and he was captured. He spent the rest of the war in a prison camp. After the war, he moves all the way out to Texas, and he was beyond excited to come back to Gettysburg because he wanted to go to the battlefield, go to Culp's Hill, and find the boulder, the rock that he had sheltered behind during the battle. So he got on a train with his attendant. Train took him all the way out here. As the train was rounding a bend outside of Baltimore, Maryland, Hammaker was in his bunk. And as the train turned, he fell out of the bunk and broke his hip. And so he goes directly from the train to the hospital here in Gettysburg. He begged the nurses to take him out on the battlefield so he could try to find that rock. He begged the nurses. One of the more famous veterans to come back was a man by the name of Otto R. Gillette. He was 93 years old, and he becomes one of the camp celebrities. First of all, he was a survivor of the Second Mississippi, so he served in Pickett's charge. He was actually interviewed by a lot of different radio organizations. And I'm going to see, we can get some audio of Gillette describing Pickett's charge. See if it works.
General Gillette, will you tell us in your own words your experiences during the celebrated Pickett charge at the Bloody Angle with the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, I belong to the Davis Division, Davis Brigade, and we got about 10 feet up the slope. And we had quarters were living at waiting by time. Run like hell. You don't mean to say, General Gillette, the soldiers run. One tells you did, he tells you damn.
So if you didn't hear that last part, the radio host asked him what he meant by turn. And Gillette responded, run like hell. And the radio man says, you don't mean to say, General Gillette, that soldiers run? And he responds, well, if one tells you he didn't, he's telling you a damn lie. There were a lot of lies told. There were a lot of lies told in 1938 at Gettysburg. One of the first was that Otto R. Gillette wasn't a general. He was a general in the United Confederate Veterans, not in the actual Army of Northern Virginia. He was a sergeant at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. But again, he was a great celebrity. And the more you talk to Otto R. Gillette, the bigger his stories got. He had a jug of whiskey he kept under his cot in his tent. And if you came in, you'd take a swig of whiskey with General Gillette, and he'd tell you stories. He said that he was on a first-name basis with Jefferson Davis. He told people that he taught Jeb Stuart's banjo player how to play the banjo. And the longer the anniversary goes, the bigger these stories get. Another man that was telling some tall tales was William Barnes. Now, William Barnes was a veteran of the 1st United States Colored Troop Heavy Artillery, and he was born a slave. He was born enslaved. In 1864, he's in Kentucky. He flees, gets his freedom, and he enlists in the Union Army. He told reporters that he was 112 years old. Now, do I think he was 112 years old? No, I don't. But I also don't think he knew how old he was. Remember, he's born a slave. And so he knows he's pretty old. He's not sure exactly what his actual birth date is, but he's pretty darn old. When a reporter asked him, what's the secret to your longevity? He said that he drank a gallon of gin a month. And that's what kept him alive for so long. Now, this gentleman who claimed to be a Confederate veteran, John Saling, he turns out to be 5 years old in 1863, so probably not a Confederate veteran. He was probably trying to work the pension system to get a pension, and it just kind of snowballed, and so now in 1938, this 5-year-old is showing up claiming to be a Confederate general. But everywhere the veterans went, they were celebrities. Everywhere they went. Martin Loop, 96 years old, a Union veteran, climbed the tower over on Oak Ridge. The tower's still there today, but it's only about a quarter of the size that it was in 1938. And so he'd be at the top of the tower signing autographs for everybody that came up. Some of the veterans caught on that you could charge people for autographs. There's one veteran who claimed that he was charging 1 cent, and by the end of the day, he had 80 cents. And he considered that a great success. There is almost a riot on the first day of the reunion. Now, if you were a veteran and you come to Gettysburg, you eat at set times, depending on where your tent is. They tried to keep it organized. But you could have refreshments whenever you wanted. And they had established these little refreshment stands on the campus of Gettysburg College where you could go and get alcoholic drinks, like hot toddies. Well, they knew the veterans were probably going to drink a lot. But by the end of the first day, they had completely run out of booze. And they had to dispatch military planes to go to nearby bases and towns to bring more booze into the anniversary. Your job as an attendant, well, you had a couple jobs. Again, every veteran had an attendant with them. And in a lot of cases, it was a wife, might be a son or a daughter, a spouse, grandchildren. Your job is to keep your loved one alive. Keep them alive. Make sure they arrive at the meal tents at the right time, and don't damage government property. That's your job. So get your veteran to Gettysburg on July 5th, leave, and don't damage anything. The first official day of the reunion, July 1st, was Reunion Day. And Reunion Day, it took place mostly on the campus of the college. They had established this large, almost amphitheater there, and it was a lot of speeches, mainly. You had speeches by Overton Bennett representing the Grand Army of the Republic. You had speeches by John Claypool representing the Confederate veterans. Governor Earl of Pennsylvania was there. And so it's very much a formal kickoff to the event. The next day, that was known as Veterans Day. And this is a demonstration, really by the modern United States military, of their firepower, again, of their technical capabilities. And again, I alluded to this earlier, but can you imagine being a Civil War veteran, someone who fought at Antietam or Shiloh, that marched with John Bell Hood, trudged these dusty roads, camped out in these canvas tents, and now you're seeing planes overhead and radios and these things that you would never have even imagined could exist in 1863. I think that kind of underscores a lot about the reunion, though. For the individuals organizing this reunion, it was as much about their generation as it was about the 1863 generation. The highlight of the reunion, though, was on July 3rd, known as Memorial Day or President's Day. And this was going to be the opportunity, the occasion, to dedicate a new monument on the battlefield, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. And that was going to be when Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, would come to visit the camps. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there had been ideas about a peace memorial floating around since as early as 1913. And as I told you, World War I and the deaths of a lot of the veterans organizing it caused the entire project to stall. But they revive it in 1935. They talked about all kinds of different locations for this peace memorial, including on the top of Big Round Top. They were going to level off the top of it and have the monument there. Ultimately, they chose a site on Oak Hill because of its proximity to town and because of the proposed design. It's going to be fed by a gas line to keep a natural gas flame burning eternally. And so the location on Oak Hill was ultimately chosen. It's the work of an architect by the name of Paul Philippe Cray. July 3rd, 1938 is the busiest day in the history of Gettysburg. As I mentioned, over the entire anniversary, you have about 450,000 people. We know at least 250,000 people were physically there to witness this dedication. It got so bad that the Pennsylvania State Police were actually on the roadways coming into town, turning people away, saying the entire borough had reached capacity. The memorial was going to be unveiled by a Union and Confederate veteran. So it was covered in this enormous American flag. And at the designated moment, these two veterans would go and pull a lanyard. And the lanyard was for show more than anything. They had an automatic device triggered by a switch that they were going to push. But those two individuals off on the left, they were the models for a commemorative coin that the United States Mint issued in 1935. And it was through the sale of those commemorative coins that they funded a lot of this event. And today, if you're lucky enough to get your hands on one of those 1935 Gettysburg commemorative coins, they are worth a good deal of money. I'd be happy to accept one if you want to hand them my way. The highlight, obviously, of the dedication, besides the monument itself, was the speech of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The entire dedication ceremony is available online. You can listen to the actual audio thanks to the Roosevelt Presidential Library. What I hope to do here is give you a sense of what Roosevelt said, though, because I think his remarks at Gettysburg are very revealing about where his mind is, but also about some of the challenges facing the country and how we can look at this Civil War generation to give us hope. Let's see if this works.
Lincoln spoke in song for all who fought upon this field, that the years have laid their palm upon its wound. Men who wore the blue, men who wore the gray, are here together, a fragment spared by time. They are brought here by the memories of
I think Roosevelt touched upon the central theme of the 1938 reunion. And that's that a united nation, striving ahead as one country, can accomplish almost anything. And these survivors of this most traumatic of events in our national history are an example of what we can do when we put the trauma of the past behind us and focus on the future. So I think Roosevelt is looking ahead to conflict brewing on the horizon. And he wants the country to take inspiration and hope from these veterans at Gettysburg in 1938. But that was essentially it. That would end the 1938 reunion. The veterans went back to their camps one final time. There was a firework demonstration. And then on July 5th and July 6th, the veterans started to board their trains to head home. And I think every single one of those individuals, as they left, recognized that a chapter of history was over. It was gone. It was closed. The tent city would quickly vanish. The event would fade into history. And Gettysburg College was getting ready for the fall semester. And so the campus reverted back to how it normally is. Within weeks of the end of the reunion, Nazis would rally in Nuremberg. The Imperial Japanese Army would overrun Canton. The year 1938 would see the Kristallnacht pogrom against the Jews in Germany and the completion of some of the first concentration camps in Austria. And if the 1938 reunion in Gettysburg can be considered that final chapter in the living memory of the Civil War, I think you can also see it maybe as the prologue for the World War to come. The 1938 reunion remains shrouded in a lot of myth. And one of the most persistent myths is that during the reunion, none of the veterans died. It's actually not true. Paul Hawley, the individual commanding the 1st Medical Regiment, that reported during the reunion, 2 veterans died. 2. The Gettysburg Times put that number at 3. A further 6 would die on the way home. Now, it's obviously terrible, but remember, they're anticipating, under normal conditions, as many as 90 dying. And at most, it's 3 that died during the reunion itself. With that said, virtually every single veteran got medical care of some kind during the reunion. So his medical detachment, they took care of virtually every single one there. A total of 77 required hospitalization. So hardly the mass casualty incident that they had planned for, which is wonderful. Only one veteran went missing. His name was James Handick. He's 104 years old. And at some point, he just vanished from the camps. A few days later, they found him watching a baseball game in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, half asleep. So he was the only one. He was the only one that went missing. What happened to them? Well, Paul Hawley would go from commanding the medical detachment at Gettysburg for the 1938 reunion to overseeing care for Allied soldiers during the Normandy campaign, during Operation Torch in North Africa. Paul Hawley would later say that he thanked God every single day for Jonathan Letterman. And Jonathan Letterman, of course, is the medical director for the Army of the Potomac. And part of me wonders is, if during his time here at Gettysburg, if Paul Hawley took increased interest in the story of the medical care of the actual combatants during the Battle of Gettysburg, and maybe if he knew a little bit about the work that Jonathan Letterman did, because it's essentially the Letterman plan that Paul Hawley is using during the Second World War. But he'd go right from Gettysburg a few years later to the European theater in World War II. John Rice, the chairman of the commission, would go on to become ambassador to Netherlands during the Kennedy administration. There's no real monument to him, but there is a dorm building on the campus, Gettysburg College campus, named after John Rice. So if you're a freshman at Gettysburg College, you may very well stay at Rice Hall on the campus of Gettysburg College. Overton Mennett, the leader of the Grand Army of the Republic, would die in January of 1941. That same year, membership in the GAR, again, which almost got to 500,000 members at its peak, had dwindled down to just 763. The last meeting of the GAR occurred in August of 1949, where the final 16 surviving members parted for the last time. James Hammaker. Now, he was the veteran that I told you about a little earlier, the man that fell out of his train car on the way to Gettysburg. Well, they did take him out to the battlefield, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't find that boulder, couldn't find it. They get him well enough to travel to Walter Reed Hospital. He spends some time there recuperating and recovering, and they finally get him back to Texas. He dies in September of 1938 as a result of his injury on the way to Gettysburg. So you could conceivably call him the last casualty of the Battle of Gettysburg. Dies in 1938. William Jackaway, you might remember him. He was the final survivor of the 72nd Pennsylvania. He would become the last surviving veteran in Philadelphia. On April 6, 1941, at the age of 100, he makes the newspapers again by challenging Adolf Hitler, whom he called a big bag of wind, to a fight. Quote, anytime, anywhere, any style. And he almost outlives Hitler. He dies on April the 22nd, 1944. William Barnes, at age 112, the elder statesman of the Reunion, passed away in August of 1940. And he's buried in San Francisco National Cemetery under this very unassuming white headstone. We did a little bit more research on his story, and it turns out most likely at the time of his death, he was 106. So not quite as old as he claimed to be. And so, working from that, he would have been approximately 104 years old at the time of the reunion, so the second oldest man there, not the oldest. Now, the most tangible piece of the 1938 reunion that's still with us is, of course, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, which is still there today, burning on Oak Hill. In the late 70s, early 1980s, because of the gas shortage, they replaced it with, essentially it looks like a giant light bulb that they kind of screwed on top. They did away with that in, I believe, 1988, and it has burned pretty consistently since then. Now, the truth be told, it goes out all the time. It's on an automatic starter, though, so every time it rains, it goes out, but it's just constantly turning back on. And we certainly do our best to keep that flame alive for those veterans and for those who fought here in 1863. Historian Bruce Catton called Gettysburg a national shrine filled with romantic memories which are in themselves a kind of forgetting. And I think there are a few chapters in the Gettysburg story that are romanticized as the 1938 reunion at Gettysburg. And I think the truth is that reunion in 1938 was more about the generation then in power than it was about the Civil War veterans. In 1887 and 1913, the reunion were organized by veterans. In 1938, it was planned by the generation who, again, were in power at that time. It was highly choreographed, the entirety of it. And so moments like this that you see up on the screen, they're more stagecraft than they are these organic demonstrations of respect and comradeship and reconciliation. I do think that the 1938 reunion at Gettysburg does represent a high point in our history, though, at least in terms of how the American Civil War was remembered, though. Because you do have these old veterans coming back to Gettysburg and putting a lot of that anger behind them and meeting their once enemy out on the battlefield again. Certainly for race relations, for African American veterans of the Civil War, this was a defining chapter in that story, where they could come back to Gettysburg and be on equal footing with their white counterparts. But again, I think the 1938 reunion at Gettysburg is a remarkable part of the Gettysburg story. It would fundamentally change how Americans thought about the American Civil War, how they would remember it. It would leave lasting footprints on the battlefield that we have here today. And so the next time you see an image like this, either out on the battlefield or in a museum or used even on social media, my hope is now you know a little bit more about how that event came to be, some of the challenges that faced the organizers and the veterans, and a greater appreciation for this overlooked chapter in the Gettysburg story. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you all.